Nihanyang. Hello, I am the Dark Fang, and welcome back to The Right Way. I'm sorry, it's been a while since I filmed one of these. I just got into filming a lot of different things, so this kind of fell by the wayside, but now I am back, and today we're going to be talking about the main antagonist of your story, so let's get into it. Okay, so the main antagonist is a lot like creating a main character. I find that the process is kind of a little bit similar to how you would develop your character. There's an kind of an essence of storyboarding, kind of where you start with the basics, and that can be a physical description, kind of a mapping out of their kind of characteristics and personality, and asking questions, and kind of from there branching out into a little bit more of a complex character. It's definitely totally okay to make a villain or antagonist for the sake of there being like an opposing force, just like some evil person or thing that your main character has to overcome. Personally, I find that villains and antagonists, they have the potential to have some like the most interesting kind of stories or attributes, and I feel like having an antagonist who has such a backstory, it can really open up the world and kind of explore more into it than if you're just kind of looking through your main character or character's eyes. It kind of gives things a new perspective and can help to develop some like complex layers to your story, which is always fun and helps to kind of immerse your readers a little bit more. So I guess kind of the first step that I take when deciding or when making a main antagonist is kind of deciding what or who they are, really. For example, an antagonist can be another character in the story. It can be an institution, sort of. It can be sort of an internal struggle, maybe, that your character is trying to overcome. It can manifest in different ways. So, for example, I have a couple different stories. So, in my story of The Executioner, where Siren is kind of trying to kind of overthrow the kingdom, the main antagonist is kind of the kingdom and its sort of laws and institution, and that all of that is embodied kind of within the king. So her kind of main focus, her main opposing force is the king and kind of everything he stands for. In another story, my Exorcist story, her main struggle is actually more internal. So she has to try and kind of overcome her guilt, which is manifested in the form of like the ghost of the victim she accidentally murdered. But then she also has another sort of underlying, slightly more like apparent antagonist in the kind of boss ghost that she has to face at the very end. So it can kind of come in different ways. I find that having like a somewhat like physical or visual representation, at least, of an antagonist that might be like like if you want to have like an idea or some more of like a concept as your antagonist, like kind of manifesting that in a visual or like a physical way kind of helps to the readers as well to kind of follow along and see kind of what the progress and like the effects against this antagonist are. So creating this antagonist, once you've kind of decided what form your antagonist is going to take, then it's kind of onto that character development sort of a stage. And if you haven't seen my video on making a main character, I'll put a link to that here, as well as I suppose in the description, since it can be very similar. in creating kind of a backstory and like figuring out their motivations, figuring out kind of what happened to this character to kind of lead them down a path that is so opposite or so opposing to your main characters. Essentially, you're kind of figuring out maybe like why they fell from grace or why they grew up the way they did, and kind of what put them into this position to kind of be your opposing force, your villain, your antagonist, etc. And this is kind of done a lot behind the scenes because unlike your main character, your main antagonist, you won't have a whole story or novel to kind of explore this character and really bring in depth and kind of have that development. A lot of that has either already happened in the past of your story or your world, or you don't see it since you're focused on your main character's journey for the most part. So now you kind of have to decide, once you have your character's motivations and goals and sort of persona, now it's time to kind of establish that link between them and your main character, that link between them and kind of the rest of the world, like what it is about them that is so deplorable or so in opposition to what your character wants, or kind of like the reason behind why they need to be brought down or taken care of or addressed, whatever that kind of resolution you're aiming for is. So determining kind of that relationship, and it can be done in a few different methods, I suppose, because these things, kind of revealing these attributes and relationships, it's a bit more indirect than what your character is experiencing. So for example, like to learn about the antagonist, like that can take place in the form of like dreams or potentially flashbacks, or from your character's perspective, like things that are happening to other people, as well as like things that have happened to them. And that's kind of a difference between like kind of an internal like absorption of what has been done to them versus like an external view of what has happened to something else. For example, in my Exorcist story, a lot of her past trauma and stuff like that is relayed through dreams and nightmares that she has, as well as kind of like PTSD moments when she gets just like visions of the boy that she accidentally killed, etc. Or in my executioner story, a lot of that, a lot of like the king's influence is revealed kind of through the flavor of the world and kind of how the common folk are kind of treated at the executions, and that kind of difference between them and the richer citizens of this world. So there's kind of a disparity there that is evident, and then my character kind of has an opinion and a sort of reflection on that, and then she kind of starts to see things in a different way, and that starts to affect her differently. So kind of different ways to kind of show like how the antagonist might affect the world, might affect other people, might affect your character, and kind of revealing that throughout the story to kind of help lead up to that final resolution. Now for the final resolution, that's kind of another thing to consider, and for this I kind of find that planning it out beforehand doesn't necessarily always pan out the way that I think it will. I tend to focus very much on like endings first and also beginnings. But sometimes when you're writing, it takes you in a completely different direction than you originally expected, which is totally fine and honestly pretty cool. So I think it's nice to have kind of an idea of what you want the resolution between your antagonist and your protagonist to be, but be aware that it can change and go with it if it does. You don't have to lock in and like change the rest of your story to fit the ending you want necessarily. Sometimes you gotta change your ending to fit the story you've written. So, but this kind of resolution, it can be a multitude of things, and it could honestly, your character could honestly think of one sort of resolution at the beginning, and then throughout the story, as their character changes and develops, maybe they then tend towards a different resolution. So maybe your character is just hell-bent on killing this villain, but then like as they travel through the world and meet new people, maybe their mind changes and instead they're able to forgive the villain or embrace the villain's differences, etc. It could be a lot. So think about whether you want this to be like a battle of victorious triumph, if you want it to be kind of an uncertain kind of meeting and end where neither party maybe really wins, neither party maybe really loses. They might come back to clash again. Or with the antagonist too, they definitely have potential as well to grow and develop while your story is ongoing, whether through direct actions your character takes or that happens to them, or indirect means. They can definitely grow and change as well, and maybe their motivations at the start of the novel are different by the end of the novel, and maybe they aren't really the antagonist at all. So a lot of different kind of paths that you can take. So I'd recommend like exploring different ones and kind of seeing which one feels right to you when kind of having your final showdown with your main antagonist, your protagonist. Sometimes you just gotta go with what you've already written and kind of go with the outcome that you would expect. Sometimes you pull a twist and some things change, pull a 180 and can be unexpected and maybe call for another story. And I can kind of give some examples maybe. So like for my Exorcist story, I'll just try to stick with the same two examples. The Exorcist story, that one's a little bit different because there's kind of like two main antagonists that she's kind of trying to overcome. One is a little bit more internal and the other is external, which is the big scary boss ghost. So like with the big ghost, he's kind of like a all-consuming evil, needs to be destroyed kind of a thing. But whereas her relationship with William, the ghost of the boy she accidentally kills, that starts off as like very tense and like antagonistic and very it kind of just brings forth kind of her own guilt and self-loathing and stuff like that. That kind of eventually starts to change, and like kind of through her acts and like her personality and they're spending time together, that kind of ends up kind of changing. Instead of something that she wants to avoid or get rid of or something like that, it kind of becomes something that she knows to live with and kind of on the path towards redemption more so than kind of self-destruction. So with the executioner, my character Siren, she has kind of just hell-bent on destroying the king of this nation, and she kind of starts to open, even though originally she is kind of on the side of the king because she kind of works for him and such, but things eventually change so that what was once her primary goal, which was just to kind of be obedient, execute the people she needed to execute, keep the common folk kind of in line, that kind of shifts towards the king and kind of all his like unfair kind of injustices and stuff like that. So hers kind of remains pretty much the same, I would say, throughout her story, because that's kind of in line with her character and her personality, despite kind of the little bits of growth and development that she undergoes just through meeting certain people. But anyways, getting a little bit too into it. But yeah, those I would say are some things to take away for when you're making a main antagonist. I will recap them. So kind of deciding who or what your antagonist is going to be, and then kind of coming up with a backstory for them the same way you would for a main character. Kind of starting off with the basics and then asking more questions, answering them, and kind of developing more of like what their motivations are, what their goals are, how they came to be here, and why, etc. And then determining the relationship between your antagonist and your character, and figuring out how to sprinkle that into the novel, whether through flashbacks or visions or direct confrontations potentially, and then lastly kind of determining what your resolution is going to be, whether it's ultimate defeat or an uncertain truce or something like that. So those are kind of the basics of a main antagonist, and it really helps, I think, to add a bit of flair to your story and kind of introduce things in a little bit of a different way, in a bit of a different flavor, so you get not just the bias of your narrator, but also you then get someone else's point of view from potentially from like a very different kind of source. So and so the writing exercise for this video is to I believe in the previous times I've asked you to come up with a main character for one of the stories. So for that story, come up with your main antagonist, sketch out who they are, what they are, and how they relate to your character. But thanks so much for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe and all that for more content. And I hope I will be filming more of the right way. I hope these videos are helpful to you, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!